Hello. The following interview about Cannabis, a Viper Vaudeville, was recorded on December 17th, 2021, in anticipation of a production as part of Prototype Festival 2022, which got postponed due to COVID. Produced by Here in a co-presentation with La Mama, Cannabis opened for a 3-week run on July 14th, 2022. Hello, this is Chuck Sachs for Indie Opera Podcast, and I've invited composer, music director Grace Galu and librettist co-director Baba Israel to talk about their show Cannabis, a Viper Vaudeville that is being presented from January 8th through 15th at La Mama's as part of Prototype Festival 2022. Hello, thank you for joining me. That's Baba and then Grace.
Yes.
Hello, it's a pleasure.
So, first off, can you tell me where this subtitle, A Viper Vaudeville, comes from and what does it mean for this project?
Sure, yeah, I can.
Feel free to begin.
I'll swing something on that. So, our director, Talvin Wilkes, who's a wonderful artist, director, playwright, dramaturg. When we, were in early conversations about this project, we were talking about what was the form of this show going to be, and he started, throwing out this line, Cannabis, a hallucinatory vaudeville, and because we were thinking about the aesthetic of the show, because it's really a concert, that tells a story through song, and so vaudeville, it's just a word that is complex. There's a lot of rich history with vaudeville, but a lot of problematic things with vaudeville, but it's such a part of American culture. And so we wanted to subvert that and play with that.
It's really evocative of a time period.
It is, yeah.
Right. And vaudeville was such a variety of things.
Exactly.
That gives you a chance to play with different styles and different types of performances. It was also an American style that was created here. So
exactly.
What drew you both to writing a piece about cannabis?
Well,
so many things.
Yeah, so many things. And just, to give, because people may not know about Viper, the reason that Viper, besides the alliteration, which is always fun, my father was, a jazz musician. He was an actor in the living theater. He was a poet, but he came up in the counterculture, the beat generation and that time, and was inspired by, Louis Armstrong and jazz and, later Charlie Parker and all of those kind of folks. But he always told me about this guy named Mez Mesro. And he was Louis Armstrong's weed dealer, and he was also a clarinetist. He was a Jewish guy from Chicago,
of course,
who came to Harlem, and the people who were in the sort of jazz scene who were into cannabis were called Vipers, and it was kind of a code word. And so if you said, "Hey, I'm a Viper," then you knew that you were on the same page. So I wanted to sort of pay an homage to that time, the jazz age, and to that sort of overt secret language of jazz culture, which, still lives on today.
Highly complex compounds in its essence. First was found in the land of Kush. Himalayan foothills, medicines from the bush. Cultivated by humans 10,000 years ago in Europe. Textiles and rope, Asia, Africa, Middle East, and all the shaman smoke, the rest of the female euphoria.
So we were discussing what drew us to the project,
Yeah.
Especially through cannabis. So I'm a cannabis advocate and consumer. I'm also an epileptic. I'm a status epilepticus, and I use cannabis to regulate my epilepsy. I'm also of color. I'm a Black woman, and I feel like cannabis has been disproportionately criminalized for Black and Brown people, and incarceration rates for Black and Brown people are exorbitant. And as we go into legalization and commercialization and capitalization, I want to remind people of the suffering of Black and brown people in regards to cannabis and how it was used to incarcerate Black and brown people after Jim Crow to make sure that Blackness was illegal.
And still, and still unfortunately, sometimes today. It is
absolutely.
still, I mean, depending where you are in our country, and it's ridiculous. It really is ridiculous considering, I mean, the opioid crisis and what that really has done to humans and their livelihoods and their bodies, as opposed to what marijuana can actually do for you. I mean, not in huge amounts per se, but in medicated amounts.
Right. So we self-medicate with caffeine. We self-medicate with aspirin, Tylenol, things that can have
sugar,
things that can have harmful effects if they're consumed in excess. Things that can have psychoactive effects if they're consumed in excess. But we still trust people to self-medicate because we understand that they can be self-medicated, things. So I believe that we can do the same with cannabis based on what we've studied scientifically.
No, absolutely. And I think the other thing about, cannabis is that it is a medicine. It's a very, a big part of the show and something that really inspired me, because it's, we were inspired by a book named Smoke Signals, written by a great author named Martin Lee. And he describes, the first moment where cannabis became legal medically was around the AIDS crisis in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And, AIDS activists were at the forefront of cannabis activism, because cannabis, like there's a line, the munchies literally save lives. Able to eat more and more people will survive. People were dealing with the wasting syndrome. It was such a hard time. And cannabis was creating relief from pain, from nausea. It was giving people motivation to eat. It was helping with mood and anxiety. And this wonderful man, Dennis Perron, who was an incredible, AIDS activist and, queer activist, set up this place called the San Francisco Buyers Club. And when it was completely illegal, and just made a space where people could gather and have healing and communion. And so that's part of the motivation, is to share these stories and to share, who the heroes were,
Also, when we began this, it was still legal in New York City. So this was very recent, the legalization, and happened during the pandemic. So we feel in it now, and the freedom of it, it's still becoming embodied and in our muscle memory, but I still feel how recent that is.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, and also, I mean, it moved from the AIDS crisis, although probably was used before that also to deal with cancer patients. Just it wasn't known as much that it was being used then. I mean, Lord knows, I just read a post from one of my favorite online people, Babe. If you don't know her work, and she just posted about amphetamine use and how it was prescribed in the 1950s and before that, by doctors and by the whole medical institution, to soldiers, to the housewives, that you could actually order it through Sears Roebuck. It's like, until finally it became a class 2 drug, because then they finally figure out, oh, wow, this is addictive. Whereas, I mean, marijuana is a natural grown, it's natural. It's as opposed to everything else that is so fabricated. And it's, not that I do it, but I'd rather put marijuana into my body than most of the pharmaceuticals that are out there. I can't, because I'm allergic to smoke and things like that, so.
Well, we do use edibles. We do use tincture. There's other methods nowadays.
This is true. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many different ways.
Yes.
And so, how did you two come to collaborate together? I know you're both part of founding members of Soul Inscribed, which is a hip hop soul band. Is that where you both started?
Jazz, R&B.
I was just reminiscing about this. So when I first started writing this show and I came up with the concept for it, I knew that I wanted to work with a woman singer to share the storytelling with me, that was really important. And so we put the word out one night, and we were going into the studio in Brooklyn, and Grace got the call, and it was a winter night, and She trooped down to the studio, 2-hour train ride, and she came in and, recorded the demo of the opening song of the show, which is called Plan to the People. Yeah, Rope Dope, Plan to the People, Rope Dope. And she just nailed it. She took the words and brought them to life exactly as I was dreaming about. And I just felt, her command of melody, her just ability to switch genre, and the ability to storytell through voice. Mm-hmm. And I just said, yeah, we got to do this together. And we started collaborating. And then it became really clear that Grace was the composer of this show because of her knowledge of, all of the different genres that we were exploring, because this is a time traveling show. And, we moved from the jazz age to the 50s, 60s, all through, when we use the genres of music to take us through time. And Grace really understands all those genres and can bring them to time through voice.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel such catharsis from being part of this show. It really gives me a platform to show so many different aspects of my musical taste and enjoyment, and I would say virtuosity, just to my own horn. And I've never been in a kind of piece like this before that had this amount of diversity in music throughout time. And so I really feel like it's suited for my skill set. And because it's in the oral tradition, as a composer, it's also really suited to my background. So, I'm working with improvisers and working with jazz musicians. We're working with hip hop musicians, and the idea of the cipher and the idea of collaboration within a collective. So this has been a wonderful process.
Yeah.
So from that first meeting, also Soul and Scribe became founded.
Soul and Scribe was actually already in existence.
I actually was on an album of Soul and Scribes before I ever collaborated with Baba. I did some vocals where we hadn't actually been in the studio together.
Yeah, so it was funny. It was just like, Grace. I was like, oh yeah, Grace was on that song.
And we also fell in love in this process.
We also fell in love too.
We've been in a relationship now for about 5 years because.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Wow,
Yes.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you met the way people who do like voiceovers for cartoons and things like that. They never actually meet,
Right?
because they're never actually in the same room usually.
Yep. And then when we finally got in the same room, we fell in love, basically.
Yes, exactly. Well, we now know that we've met many times, and it was really great that we didn't connect until that period of time because we're in different walks of life.
It was the right moment. It was the right moment. Yeah, and it's been a journey with a lot of growth and learning, and I think we're both better people and better artists for knowing each other. Yeah.
So what should the audience expect when they're coming to Cannabis? I mean, what are the different all the different musical styles that we're going to be hearing, and also theatrical styles?
Yeah.
So, we go from the time of the ancient Scythians to pretty much modern times to hip hop. So it's Homer to hip hop, to use a course that Baba and I teach. Yeah. So there's a diverse amount of musical styles, but it's also about the difference in this in terms of cannabis storytelling is that I have found that the paradigm has been very male so far. We got the Cheech and Chong. I feel like the cannabis world.
Method Man and Redman.
Yeah, we have a very male-dominated, somewhat misogynistic.
That's polite.
Yeah, that was a polite, environment when it comes to cannabis, and then it's also sort of juvenile. I would say. I know that there's cynicism in there. There's other things that are more profound, but I would say that this story is actually about suffering in some ways. We're really not uncomfortable with the loss and the grief and the disenfranchisement, but it's through the joy of music that we bring that story in. So we're using music to keep the joy and keep the celebratory sense, but we're also being serious about what is happening with cannabis and what has happened with cannabis.
Yeah, and to give you a little taste of music, I mean, there's many different styles of jazz. We've done sort of reworking of a wonderful Ella Fitzgerald tune. So that kind of, 30s, 40s era and sound. There's moments that, are more bebop. There's moments where we go into, rock, funk, soul. There's reggae, there's hip hop, as we've said.
There's bossa nova.
There's some bossa nova. There's we go a lot of different places musically. And, there's a whole piece that is in honor of Pancho Villa and the Mexican Revolution and the role cannabis played in the Mexican Revolution.
So we do some Mexican punk rock, some LA rock.
Yeah, there's Mexican punk rock, thrash, hardcore.
Some metal.
Some metal. I mean, it really is, cannabis has touched so many genres that it really, and the freedom of the vaudeville, as we said before, it allows us to go to any style. And then I think it's important to say too, when you say styles of theater, we're working with members of an incredible company called Urban Bushwomen, and they really use dance to do embodied storytelling, and so, 3 of their core team are part of the choreographic team. And then we're also working with a wonderful dancer called Raka James, who's a crumper and a hip hop dancer. And so they've been exchanging. And so, and then now they've got us dancing. And, so it's really become this ensemble piece, this ensemble concert of music and poetry and rap and song and dance. And we've got, and there's numbers. I mean, there's songs that really have, Grace, for all of her richness in the African diasporic tradition, is also deeply steeped in musical theater. And, so that's one of her loves too. So, there's songs that have that feel, but with a soul funk twist, so.
We're definitely rooted in the spirit of the remix. So we often will start a number in its original form or with a sampling in its original form. And then we try to bring it into a context that's familiar, but yet unfamiliar from the original version.
Yeah.
So it's basically something for everyone, kind of like
absolutely
go into a bodega.
Exactly.
That's good. That's right. And I remember
love the word bodega.
Bodega is perfect, but I remember we did the show, actually we did an early version of it in Colorado, in Telluride, Colorado.
Okay.
And one of the things that really excited me is that the audience that came out was 20 to 70. Because Grace does an amazing version of the Beatles, that's like this soul version, and so people who remember the 60s and have that sense of pride in that moment of counterculture are going to feel connected and represented, but also younger folks are going to feel like their styles and aesthetics. So it really is an intergenerational show, and I think that was important to us in the style of music that we wanted to approach, make it an inviting experience.
Well, I mean, that excites me. I love variety in pieces, and I'm a Gemini, so it's like my mind will buzz places. It's like absolutely. So I now you, Bobby, your family was part of the Living Theater.
Yes.
But also I want both of you to say, who do you think has most influenced your creative style and why? So we can start with Bob or Grace or whichever.
You have a preference?
I'll begin. It's really hard to say because I do have a sort of diverse background. My father is Congolese, as they would say, and he immigrated to New York in the 1980s, and met my mother, a Catholic worker, where she was volunteering, and she's Irish Catholic. And my mom was a wonderful actress and loves musical theater, and my father is also deeply immersed in music, but with very different tastes. And I felt like I grew up in a real eclectic environment of music. And then I sang in Catholic school. And I went to a school, I was very privileged, where we put a musical on every year. So that is part of my background. I know Baba has a diverse background in music as well.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the Living Theater, which was, a wild countercultural space of revolutionary theater and lots of cannabis. They used it in rehearsals, they used it on stage, it was part of their whole world. But my father was also a jazz musician. And so, he raised me with a profound inspiration and appreciation for jazz, and took me to see, Dizzy Gillespie and Tito Puente and, some of the greats, when I was a little kid, and, so many other amazing art, Don Sherry, who was a more experimental artist, the Art Ensemble of Chicago. Just so I think that whole rich jazz tradition, and then later on when I got interested in hip hop, in the 90s there was this convergence of hip hop and jazz and poetry all inspiring each other. And my first performances were at the New Eurekan Poets Cafe and places like that. So I started working with a great musician named Jason Lindner, who played on David Bowie's last record. And, he really opened me up, to rapping and doing poetry and different time signatures, and, really, increased my improvisational ability, and really, gave me all kinds of exposure to different rhythms. I've been working recently with Arturo O'Farrell, who's a brilliant, composer and pianist, and, a visionary. I just came from rehearsing with him this morning.
Baba actually has a gramophone.
Oh yeah, I did. Yeah,
I'm very proud of him.
Interesting enough, I won a gramophone, which is in the classical music world, because I got invited also by this very interesting classical music festival in Sweden. And we created a record together where we were mixing hip hop and Shakespeare sonnets and classical compositions and jazz. So I'm really always been interested in fusion and hybrid kind of work. So, but I'd say some of my inspirations, and I think, when I think of you, also I think of Shaka Khan.
Shaka Khan was,
is one of your big inspirations.
But also Kathleen Battle, Audrey McDonald. My mom used to say, I like a bell voice. She loved a bell tone, and she always wanted me to learn how to sing with a bell tone. And then I would sort of rebel and say, oh, I want to hear that grid. I want that dissonance. I want those seventh notes. I want that texture. So I've learned how to embody both. Nice.
And then, in hip hop, I grew up on, the era of KRS-One and Big Daddy Kane and Rakim. Those are all important influences to me too, as a lyricist and as an MC. I just, for me, poetry, songwriting, I also was, very interested in the beat poets as a kid. Allen Ginsberg was a distant relative, and we used to go over his house sometimes, and when I was a child as well. And, some of his poetry just felt like this epic stream of consciousness with such rich language and this political and spiritual kind of ferocity. So that's also an inspiration.
We spoke a couple of months ago with the creators of Rosina,
cool.
Which is, it's a hip hop opera that resets the Barber of Seville with a feminist take.
Wow, interesting. I gotta look that up.
They're in Chicago, and you might want to check it. It's one of our earlier episodes of this year, and I think that group might interest you too, because they're kind of doing this whole mix between opera and hip hop and R&B and all these different styles, and also with dancers and crump and all of that.
Very cool. I'm definitely gonna check it out.
Yes, it's so we've got to end because I've got to keep these short. This is not the main episode. This has been fascinating, and I'm just say thank you for talking with me.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Indie Opera Podcast wishes you and all our listeners a joyous holiday season. And watch for the release of episode 85 with the creators of The Hang. And
shout out to Taylor Mack.
Yeah. That's another Prototype Festival production. And if you can, please support us via our website, indieopera.com, or on Patreon. So I'm looking forward to seeing your show in the new year. And thank you. Bye.
Bye now. It's a pleasure.
Bye.